All right, sports fans, how's everybody out there doing? William Martin coming at you one more time here on YouTube with another edition of the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge Podcast. Now, the calendar just turned to October, but already we've seen several head coaches in college football get their pink slips already. Scott Frost at Nebraska, Herm Edwards at Arizona State, Jeff Collins at Georgia Tech, Carl Durrell at Colorado, and Paul Christ at Wisconsin. Now, the first and foremost, most of these coaches that I just mentioned, with the exception of Paul Christ, you kind of had to expect it because coming into this season, and I talked about this several months ago, I said that Scott Frost was on the hot seat. I said the same thing for Jeff Collins at Georgia Tech. I'm not surprised that Carl Durrell was let go, especially with how Colorado just was losing so bad this season. And in some cases, it looked like they weren't even competing. That can't keep up, especially when you have a team in a Power Five conference. Paul Christ, I've talked about this the other night, was a surprise. And for Herm Edwards, this goes back to the offseason with his issues at Arizona State. But nonetheless, for some of these programs, the struggle to keep up in these mega conferences, when you're talking about when you have a 12 team, in some cases 14 team, and what we're going to see soon from both the Big Ten and the SEC, 16 team conferences, it's a scenario where, hey, you know what? Everybody's not going to be able to keep up with the Joneses. And there's going to be some teams that definitely get lost in the shuffle. Tyler, what's going on, my man? Paul Christ caught me way off guard. Their fan base seems to be split down the middle on it. Did you see what Braylon Allen said about it? I did not see what Braylon Allen said about it. Please feel free to clue me in on that in the chat box. But one thing, I talked about it the other night when the news broke about Paul Chris being let go, and I'll say it again. To me, this was a panic move by Wisconsin. They had unrealistic expectations as far as I'm concerned. And I'll say this: Wisconsin has never consistently gone out there and been able to get the top recruits. Wisconsin is good enough to win the Big Ten West, but when they face those top tier teams, they can't keep up because they don't have the star power. And it's been like that for years. This isn't a 1 or 2 year thing. This goes back to the days of Brett Bielema and even before that with Barry Alvarez. Now, obviously, the college football game has changed since Barry Alvarez coached at Wisconsin, and it started to transition during Brett Bielema's time, at Wisconsin. But it has really changed now. You need that star quarterback. You need those talented guys at the skill positions. And Wisconsin doesn't consistently get those guys. They're going to get the running backs because they have a strong running back tradition at that school. But nonetheless, you need stars, and that's another reason why they can't keep up. And like I said the other night, and I'll say it again, they still had a good shot to win the Big Ten West, and they still have a very good shot because, with the exception of one team, and it's like really failing me right now as we speak, everybody in the Big Ten West right now is 1-1. There's one 0-2 team right there. I want to say I'm not even going to guess, but I definitely know there's one 0-2 team there. Everybody else is 1-1. So with that said, Wisconsin. Oh, now it hit me. I'm sorry. Excuse me. Wisconsin is the only team in the Big Ten West that hasn't won a game because they lost to Illinois on Saturday, and then they got blown out last week by Ohio State. But nonetheless, they play everybody in front of them, and all of those are winnable games. Nobody, and I repeat, nobody is running away with the Big Ten West this year to the point that whoever wins that division and gets to Indy for the conference championship game, it would not surprise me to see the winner of the Big Ten West have 3 losses. That's how topsy turvy I really think that it's going to be in that division this year. Tyler, thanks for chiming in once again with what Braylon Allen said. I'm reading it right now. He said something along the lines of anyone who wanted Coach Chris fired isn't a part of this team. And yes, I agreed with what you said about it seeming like they had unreal expectations. Listen, Braylon Allen, first and foremost, is speaking the truth. And I know there's going to be a camp of people out there that are going to say, well, that's his head coach, that's the guy who recruited and brought him in X, Y, and Z. No, you got to be realistic about things. And I really feel that this was a panic button move. How many teams, good teams, do we see get blown out by Ohio State at Ohio State? Okay. And with Illinois, I think the Illinois loss was what really rubbed some people at Wisconsin the wrong way, being that Brett Bielema is coaching Illinois right now. And for the most part, he beat Wisconsin at their own game as far as running the football and playing solid defense. And that's the type of program that he's building there. He couldn't get it done with Arkansas like that in the SEC because the SEC game is much different. But now he's back in the Big Ten. He's very familiar with recruiting in that region of the country. And I think he's going to have success because he is building a legitimate foundation at Champaign for that program. But nonetheless, the expectations at Wisconsin were unrealistic. Scott Frost at Nebraska, it was one of those where I think Nebraska kind of falls into the same line of Wisconsin. Yes, Nebraska has tradition, but these kids currently they don't know anything about that tradition. And I just don't see, and I could be totally wrong on this. I just don't see Nebraska right now at this moment being able to go out there and get those top tier kids. That's the biggest thing. Herm Edwards at Arizona State, he had a lot of kids transfer out of his program over the past couple of years, most notably Jaden Daniels, who is doing his thing as far as being the starting quarterback for LSU in the SEC. Jeff Collins at Georgia Tech. I mean, this program, Georgia Tech has never been a consistent world beater, but also they were never competitive under Jeff Collins in the ACC. I talked about the lack of competitiveness from Colorado under Carl Durrell, and we just recently talked about Paul Chryst. But expectations are at an all-time high for most of these college programs, and you can focus on the salaries that a lot of these coaches are getting right now. You're getting college football head coaches that are getting maybe $5 million a year just to go 5-7 or 6-6. And we saw it last year where there was a rash of head coaches getting mega extensions due to the fact that schools were fearful of them leaving for another program. We saw the extension that James Franklin got at Penn State, that Mel Tucker got at Michigan State. We saw the money that USC threw at Lincoln Riley. We saw the money that LSU threw at Brian Kelly. And, these programs are fearful of that. And I mean, you go back and look at Florida State. Florida State a couple of years ago didn't want to give Jimbo Fisher the bump in pay that he wanted. And Florida State is still not recovered from that. And Jimbo got his money and he's in the SEC with A&M right now. But at the end of the day, most of these Power Five conferences, for all of the money that is being thrown around to all of these head coaches, most of these Power Five conferences are dominated by one or two schools. When you think about the SEC, right now, it's Alabama and Georgia and everybody else. When you think about the 14-team ACC, it's all about Clemson. When you think about the Big Ten, it's Ohio State, Michigan, maybe Michigan State, and Penn State. The Pac-12 is trying to get back there, but recently it's been Utah and Oregon, and even though USC is on their way out, they're trying to go out with a bang. And of course, the Big 12 has been dominated by Oklahoma, although things are going to look a lot different this year. I mean, we saw Oklahoma State and Baylor in the Big 12 championship game last year. I really don't see Oklahoma getting back there this year. That's a whole nother story for a whole nother day. But nonetheless, regardless of the money that is being thrown around to these coaches, these conferences are still dominated by one or two teams. So with that said, it's kind of like, you got to be realistic, but don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to sound like a hypocrite right here. You can't have the record that Scott Frost did at Nebraska and expect to not get fired. The same thing for Carl Durrell. The same thing for Jeff Collins. And, like we've talked about, Paul Chris was the real surprise. And now Wisconsin's going to pay him $11 million not to be their head coach. So, with that said, who else do I feel is in danger of getting fired? I talked about this the other day. I talked about it just prior to the season starting. Brian Harson at Auburn. I mean, the Tigers are 3-2 right now. They got embarrassed a couple of weeks ago at home, courtesy of Penn State. They squeaked by Missouri, and then we saw them this past Saturday night blow a 17-point lead at home to LSU and lose. And now Auburn has to travel and take on Georgia. Good luck with that one. But at the end of the day, Brian Harson barely survived last year. It just never has seemed like the right fit from the word go from Brian Harson leaving Boise State to come from the Mountain West to the SEC and coach Auburn. I mean, Auburn is one of those places that it could be very tricky at times as far as how things go. I mean, you look at Gus Malzahn, he was consistent, but I guess in their mind, he wasn't consistent enough. I mean, he was 3-5 against Nick Saban in Alabama. And granted, that's not a winning record, but for a lot of other head coaches, they would have loved to have gone 3-5 against Saban in 8 years in the Iron Bowl. But nonetheless, Auburn is one of those where they're really going to get caught up in the wash this year. That is the SEC West, because you still got to deal with Bama. You got Mississippi State over there that's looking good. Ole Miss is looking good. You got A&M. LSU is showing a lot of fight under Brian Kelly. So it's just, and of course Arkansas as well. So it's going to be tough pickings, I think, this year for Auburn rather. And I don't see a scenario where Mr. Harson survives. Ryan Day at Ohio State. My thoughts on him as a Buckeye fan. He seems to be an elite recruiter and has built a great staff, but hasn't won many big games yet. I think he'll get over the hump, or are we stuck with being third best? To me, on Ryan Day, I totally agree with you. He is a phenomenal recruiter, first and foremost. And you think about the talent that he has sent to the NFL, and then there is more talent on this current Buckeye team right now that I definitely think will be in the NFL in a couple of months. Ohio State, I picked them to win the Big Ten coming into the season. But right now, you see that Michigan could be a problem for them. Penn State, I know Penn State's undefeated, but I'm not blown away personally with Penn State. I think that Ohio State Michigan game is going to have big time ramifications, not only for the Big Ten, but also for the college football playoff scene. With that said, Ohio State, for the most part, and this goes back to Urban Meyer, they're the best team, the best program in the Big Ten, and it ain't even close. I think with Ohio State, sometimes they win against Clemson, sometimes they lose. But at the end of the day, I mean, we've seen them go up against Clemson in the semis a couple of times in the college football playoff out there in the Fiesta Bowl. They lost a tight one a couple of years ago. We also saw them get blown out by Clemson as well. And then they lost that Orange Bowl years ago, and that really wasn't a playoff game, but it was still a New Year's Six game. But nonetheless, but at the end of the day, if you're a Big Ten program like Ohio State or like a Michigan, you know that in order for you to win it all, you have to go through the SEC. And just changing gears very quickly from last year, to last year rather, Michigan had a ton of momentum, and Michigan was looking very, very dominant over the last month of the season. They beat Ohio State, they blew out Iowa in the Big Ten championship game. They played with a ton of they had a ton of momentum going into the college football playoff. What happens? They faced Georgia, and Georgia seemed like they were 2 or 3 gears faster than Michigan. And Michigan was a darn good team. Georgia was just that much better. So the point I'm trying to make, you got to still deal with the SEC. I mean, a couple of years ago, we saw Ohio State get to the national championship game in the shortened season. And I mean, they beat Clemson in the Sugar Bowl, but then they got Alabama in that championship game, and it wasn't even close. That right there is the separation. Ohio State is good, but they're just not consistently SEC good. We saw Ohio State beat Alabama several years. That was the initial college football playoff. That's when Ohio State won it all. And Alabama, they had issues at quarterback that year, but nonetheless, Urban Meyer knew what it took to win in the SEC, of course, from his time with Florida. And that worked to his credit, and that worked to Ohio State's credit. Obviously, the game has changed for Nick Saban since then. He's gotten more speed at the skill positions. More importantly, he's gotten better quarterbacks. So, nonetheless, that right there is still the gap. I think Ohio State is a darn good football team. They have a darn good football team this year. They have a darn good program overall. But nonetheless, it's like Ohio State's right here. Alabama and Georgia are just right there. And right now, at least, as long as Ohio State has to deal with the Georgias and with the Alabamas, it's going to be tougher. And I think the biggest thing for me in watching Ohio State under Ryan Day, they have the quarterbacks that can succeed. They have the wide receivers and the running backs that can succeed as well. But when they're facing in Alabama right now, do they have the guys in their front seven that can put enough pressure on those Alabama quarterbacks? That's the big thing. You go back to that national championship game from a couple of years ago, and they couldn't do anything defensively to slow down that Alabama offense, and that was a big reason why the Crimson Tide won and Ohio State finished second. You go back to that Sugar Bowl against Clemson, totally different story. They dictated the pace against Trevor Lawrence and Clemson. That was not the case against um, Alabama in that game. And for what it's worth, Ohio State, they got punched in the mouth in against Michigan, in that season finale last year in a way that most of us really did not expect to happen. So that's going to be interesting to see, what goes down in the rematch next month. Obviously, Michigan's defense looks a lot different since then. Of course, David Ajabu and Aiden Hutchinson are now in the NFL. Of course, Ajabu is working his way back from the injury, but nonetheless, I hope I answered your question to the best of my ability. Right now, I just think Ohio State is just that much behind Alabama and Georgia. And I think that's the biggest difference right now, at least, why the Buckeyes just haven't been able to get over that hump in recent years. I still think they are a phenomenal team, a phenomenal program, and I think they're going to be right there in the mix in the postseason. And I mean, so far at this portion of the Big Ten season, we've seen how dominant that Ohio State could be. Don't get me wrong, Rutgers is not a good football team, but I mean, even after giving up that early touchdown to Rutgers on the turnover this past Saturday, what did Rutgers do? We saw them just destroy Wisconsin. And I think at the end of the day, Wisconsin is a better football team than people, at least the people around their program right now, want to give them credit for. Because I think even with Paul Chris or Jim Leonard, excuse me, whoever's leading this team, they still were going to win 9 games, maybe 10 games. But like I said, they just push the panic button. But nonetheless, this I think is the underbelly of what happens when you have these mega conferences and guys are getting paid the ridiculous amount of money. And I'm not trying to slight them in any way, shape, or form. If you have an opportunity to get it, go for it. But the ridiculous amount of money that we're seeing thrown around for college football head coaches right now, the expectations increase. And whenever alumni are chipping in their money and boosters and TV money, all of that stuff, when all of that comes into play, especially from the alumni and the boosters, they want to see a return on their investment. They want bragging rights against their rivals. They want to see conference championships. They want to see big bowl games, the whole 9 yards. Everybody is not going to be able to do that. And like I said, it's the teams at the top that are feasting and will continue to feast. And just switching gears here a little bit, it's just like the same thing as far as my take on the college football playoff. You can expand it all you want. You could have 12 teams, 24 teams, 50 teams. At the end of the day, it's still going to be Alabama. It's still going to be Georgia. You're going to have Ohio State. Okay. You're going to sprinkle in some Clemson, maybe Oklahoma. I'm saying that for right now, but I want to see how things look for them once they go to the SEC. But nonetheless, it's going to be the usual suspects. So these programs are going to throw around all of the money that they want. The expectations can be there, this, that, and the third. But the bottom line is there's only a couple of teams that are going to dominate and feast at the table, which is what we continue to see on the college football scene. So, folks, that is going to wrap it up. And as always, I want to take this time out to thank you for tuning into the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast here on YouTube. I want to take this time out to thank all of you fine folks out there for tuning in. And if you have not already, please feel free to like this podcast and also subscribe to this channel. Special thanks, as always, to Tyler Spencer. I always appreciate you chiming in, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, and it's not lip service. It's a legitimate. I definitely appreciate the support, and I hope to keep having you on here in the future. Now, if anybody's out there on Twitter, please feel free to follow me at 300 Pounds of Sports. And like I always say, if you follow me, it'll be my pleasure to follow you right back. There's also the sports discussion group on Facebook at the Sports Depot 365. Now, you can check it out. Drop a line and be a part of one of the better sports debating sites going on social media. So, once again, fine folks, my name is William Martin. I am signing off, saying take care and have yourselves a wonderful day.